What does all of this mean? Tell you what I think it means. Imprinted gene effects, genomic copy number variation that involves these social brain genes that are expected to be found throughout our genome. These large-scale variations mediate the diametric development of autistic spectrum conditions on one hand versus psychotic spectrum conditions in the other. And we've seen all of these large-scale, big phenotypic effects. There should be all sorts of much smaller effects from smaller genomic alterations that we just haven't looked for yet. So what we have seen should be the clinical tip of a genome scale neurocognitive iceberg. This variation defines what we can call an example of human neurocognitive architecture. And this architecture involves a spectrum between autism on one hand to so-called normality in the middle and over to psychotic affective conditions over on the right. And position on this spectrum is mediated by social brain genes, what alleles for the social brain you happen to have. If we have large-scale dysregulation of these social brain genes, then we can end up at one extreme or the other extreme. So today I've talked a little bit about your brain, talked about why and how your brain has evolved. We've talked about how and why brains can become disordered via alterations to these social brain genes. We've looked at these large-scale sorts of genetic changes causing different disorders. Now we need to talk about how Darwin can help your brain and the brains of others and society. What about your brain? I think these considerations can help in enhancing at least our materialistic understanding of ourselves and how our brain works and our sense of self and our interaction with others in terms of the evolved functions of the social brain. So this is essentially what I see as our social brain doing, maximizing fitness through these different sorts of social interactions with others. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we would also predict that at least many of us would not admit that we are running around maximizing our fitness, and that is actually one prediction that one could make from evolutionary theory. And I think this sort of variation that we've talked about also helps us appreciate human cognitive diversity, from autism on one hand to schizophrenia on the other, but then the vast bulk of people being somewhere in the middle. Most scientists and engineers are probably over here, a little ways towards the autism spectrum. There's a good association, for example, between Asperger's syndrome and engineering, skills in engineering. Temple Grandin once said that if it wasn't for genes for autism, we would all be standing around in caves talking to each other. And I think she's right. We certainly wouldn't be here using machines like this. And then over here, in the zone towards mentalistic cognition, we have people who are particularly good with verbal skills, and I think we can put a lot of art and literature over in that direction. And that's why I showed you pictures of Sylvia Plath a little bit earlier. What about the brains of others? What about the alleviation of suffering? The presence of an autistic psychotic affective continuum immediately defines a large and completely novel research program in psychiatric genetics and psychiatry more generally. And this program is based on reciprocal hypothesis testing. So if we have a genetic risk factor for schizophrenia, a gene involved in schizophrenia, let's look at that gene. Is it involved in autism? We would expect it to be. If it's underexpressed in schizophrenia, is it overexpressed in autism? We want to look. We won't find out unless we do. If we know that there's a certain change in synaptic function in schizophrenia of a particular form, we can look at that synaptic function in autism. We would predict there would be an opposite sort of change to that sort of function in autistic individuals, and similarly for neurodevelopment and all sorts of other phenotypes involved in these two conditions. These conditions, by these ideas, are opposite to one another, so we immediately have a large number of robust, falsifiable predictions that we can make using information from one disorder. We can make predictions about the other. These ideas provide an evolutionary framework for therapy. We have known for many years that we should teach autistic individuals to become more socially mentalistic, teach people theory of mind skills. Baron Cohen, for example, has been instrumental in these ideas. Draw autistic individuals out socially. What should we do with people on the other side? We should essentially teach them to be more autistic and less mentalistic. What about a framework for pharmacological treatment? That is pills. I'll just show you a couple of examples here of recent development in pharmacological treatments that are relevant to the ideas I've been talking about. This receptor, mGLR5, this is a little protein that sits at a synapse and has a particular and very important function in neurotransmission for a particular type of receptor. It also looks very pretty in different colors. This receptor has been shown to be fundamentally important in the phenotypes which are caused by Fragile X syndrome, which is the most frequent autistic spectrum syndrome known in humans. So the metabolic basis for Fragile X has recently been sorted out to such a degree that we can say that overactivation of this receptor is important. You give an antagonist to this receptor to a Fragile X mouse, the mouse is essentially cured, does not develop the symptoms of Fragile X. And trials for this antagonist of this receptor are now ongoing for Fragile X individuals in humans. And Fragile X is essentially an autistic syndrome, so there's hope that these antagonists can be useful for autism. And the antagonist is specifically called phenibam here. Completely independently, one of the most exciting under development treatments for schizophrenia involves activation of these same receptors with agonists of the receptor. So we want this receptor to be expressed, to be activated, to exert its effects more strongly. This is precisely what we would expect from this sort of diametric nature of schizophrenia and autism. Very similar situation for a different receptor, ChRN7 receptor, beautiful cluster of flowers here. Some ideas have recently been described with evidence for that antagonists of this receptor may provide useful treatments for autism, and the exact opposite pharmacological agent, an agonist for this receptor, is under trial for schizophrenia. So this is a couple of examples. The basic idea, we've got a very long list of treatments, pharmacological treatments under development for schizophrenia, because that's where most of the money goes. We should have a good look at those. Could we do an opposite sort of alteration? Could that sort of alteration help alleviate the symptoms or the causes of autism? And finally, how can these ideas help more generally? Well, if these ideas that I've described are correct, and we should start finding out before too long, because all of these ideas are testable, then we come to the realization that people with autism, schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression, in the context of the evolution of these social brain traits, which are underlain by genetic variation, to the extent that these ideas are true, to the extent that this spectrum is real, these individuals are paying the evolutionary costs of the genetic changes that have made us human. So the next time you see some child with intellectual disability or some schizophrenic individual walking the streets of the downtown East Side, I'm hoping that you will look at them in a somewhat different light. Thank you very much.